We're back with another episode of Dancing with Water. I'm your host, Jennifer Mulak, here with my co host, Teresa Woodman, and our beautiful guest today, Christie. I will do your intro.
Thank you.
Christie Jordan Barron is an educator, mother, mover, maker, and somatic experiencing practitioner based in the Hudson Valley. Christie believes deeply in our essential need for connection to our own hearts, to nature, and to each other. She is dedicated to holding space for people to sense into and stay curious about the various parts and pieces that make us all tenderly human. And she has a website, interweave.com, that we will include in the show notes that talks about your offerings and what you have going on.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming
I
to
don't
talk
know if
to
thank
us.
you. I've never heard anyone read that aloud. That was
Mm.
really sweet.
Yeah, it's a really
Yeah.
beautiful bio.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll say it's interweave.1, but if you go to
Mm.
.com, you'll just find a lot of knitting things from someone
Oh.
else. So depending upon what you're into.
That's funny. Dot
Yeah.
one ONE.
Mhm.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay. Okay. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
include the
Totally
correct
fine.
link. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So I love your background and
Mhm.
especially like the somatic experiencing part that we'll get into. But I'll say that the thing that sparked our curiosity about having you on was a recent offering that you had at Good Work Institute
Mhm.
called Practice Dying, Wake Up to Life by Becoming Intimate with Death,
Mhm.
a 3-part series. And so we don't know anything about that except
Great.
that it sounds so fascinating. And so I wonder if we could start there
Sure.
with that workshop and your
Mhm.
experience in that
Mhm.
space.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything specific that you want me to start with?
I'd be curious, like, how did
Yeah.
you enter that work?
Yeah. So it's something that my friend Jeffrey and I were talking about, who was co-facilitating with me for a long time, and he's coming with a background he's an incredible musician, coming with a background of Zen and hospice work. And um we initially had I think approached Good Work Institute with this idea of offering, and it's some of it being connected to Jeffrey's holding space on Saturday mornings with a group of people. A lot of people are part of making that happen for Kingston Community Dharma. And that's the space where we've been meeting for meditation. And so it felt like a nice natural extension of the relationship to be able to offer something that felt in alignment, but also separate. Um, and a lot of our work felt complementary in the sense that he has very hands-on experience being with death in a way that a lot of the experience that I've had in the recent years has been with meaning grief through creative practice, somatic practices, kind of an exploration of what it looks like to be in ritual and community, um, in coming closer to some of these touch points that I think a lot of us don't have the luxury to be with, or might feel afraid to kind of be in contact with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a 3-part series. It did complete itself in May. Um, and we had a really beautiful group of 11 people. Um, each session was had this arc where we began with death and orientation, right? And kind of like landing together. The second session was um, grief and disorientation,
Hmm.
and then finally ending in life and reorientation. So we kind of had this arc together. Um,
Can you
yeah.
can you describe what you mean when you say death and
Mhm.
orientation?
Yeah, totally. So I think some of the language of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation is coming from some of Jeffrey's practices and the Zen lineage. This idea of the death, grief, and life kind of arc was coming with a curiosity of we're meeting 3 times and once a month, how we can kind of land together without landing together each time anew. So we were setting the foundation of what it means to kind of be together and gather. Um, and death being the foundation and this place that if we're talking about practicing dying, really essentially coming in through the gate of death, right? And I think the broader sense um, of just feeling those polarities between life and death, and then having the opportunity to insert different language where we're maybe speaking about transition, or we're speaking
Mhm.
about not necessarily like uh, the way in which we orient toward life and death being these like very concrete binaries, but we could easily be talking about the creative practice. We can be talking
Mhm.
about experiences. So it allowed us to invite folks in between to practice transitions as endings, right?
Mhm.
So if you thought about your boarding and you think about all the different ways that you're transitioning through space and time, um, noticing the way that you are leaving those transitions, right? Are you moving quickly? Are you spending time actually like completing the thing without going into like, gross over exaggeration? But just to start to see how we experience so many deaths throughout the day,
Mhm.
even in breath, right? So I think allowing folks to be curious in their daily lives. Yeah.
And so is the idea of doing that and being more comfortable with death
Mm,
in these smaller places,
mm,
helping support us with the big
mm.
death that's
The
inevitable?
big yeah, like little teeny,
Right,
big teeny, big
right.
yeah, maybe. I don't know if there's such a thing as, like, being comfortable with death. I think Jeffrey has a comfort maybe in a different way just in practice and seeing it, and
Mm,
I think that, my experience of orienting to death, the way in which I've experienced in my lifetime has been often a surprise,
mhm,
right? It's not, I've never sat at a bedside with somebody and been with them when they take their last breath. And also knowing that it's such a luxury to be with death in that way, and so there might be a way in which I come in more of like a metaphor space, just
mhm,
because that's been my lived experience. And really the metaphor has allowed me to be with the grief when death is something that happens suddenly, and um, I think that I think if we're gathering in spaces with the intention to make something easier versus gathering in spaces with the intention to get curious and like
mhm,
hold a bigger container for everybody in the way in which, we're speaking about what's happening in the world, right? We're speaking about what's happening within our communities, what's happening in our bodies. And so I think maybe more of like creating this network of folks that can not only, because there's such an intelligence in a group,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
Like Jeffrey
mhm,
and I, it wasn't a heavy lift, or we're here to like tell you something you don't
mhm,
know, right? So much of it was also sourcing what was there, or creating spaces where there's like a little bit of constraint, so there can be a little bit more of a flow into an idea, um, making some elements uncomfortable enough to like for something else to happen. And so I think those group spaces are dynamic in the way in which we might plan for something to happen and something completely different happens. And that's the perfect thing to
mhm,
happen.
mhm. I as you're speaking about this and the group coming together and about grief, I'm thinking about how it seems to be more in the air in
Oh, yeah.
general, right? Like the Olive Free Library
Yeah.
has like a Saturday morning grief
Yeah.
circle, lesser mysteries and greater mysteries are
Totally.
exploring that
Yeah.
too. Do you feel like it's more in the
Oh, totally.
yeah.
I mean, it's yes, absolutely in the overculture
Mhm.
in a way that maybe other things have taken their turn in popularity over time. I think death is having a
Mhm.
moment, which is really cool.
Mhm.
And I think I'm humbly entering that conversation because there have been people who have been doing this work for so long,
Mm.
that we are, like coming in and playing with an idea, right? So this offering really being uh, a lab site and an experiment rather than something that was like polished and created over time. Like we
Mhm.
are
Mhm.
both, scholars of Francis Weller's work and so many other people who are doing incredible work in this way. And yeah, and I think it was edgy to kind of even step into that space of, do I have anything to offer? You know, like what does it feel when my voice enters that conversation? And I think just coming back to like my lived experience of what that is and being really honest about where I'm coming from.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
I like I like the fact that by approaching it that way, it's almost like encouraging permission for other people
Mm,
to be curious about it versus needing to take a course to understand it
yeah.
or, to have to go to a professional necessarily to
Mhm.
get support in it. Not that those things are bad to
Mhm.
do,
Mhm.
but that's not always available or
Mhm.
practical. And
Mhm.
so to even within your circles to
Mhm.
begin surfacing awareness of those
Mhm.
transitions and how you can be supportive to other
Mhm.
people and receive support for
Mhm.
yourselves. And so I like the fact that um, there was a level of curiosity about what are we doing
Mhm.
here and in this space
Mhm.
together.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think just the knowing that everybody has something to offer, you
Yeah.
know, and I think that kind of the idea of the expert, you know, is also something that I think is being confronted at this
Mhm.
time. And
Mm.
so there's there's a way in which uh with w- with kind of breaking that mold of like needing to be an because I mean the imposter syndrome is so real,
Mhm.
and the kind of like going to grab a training or going to do a thing so that you can say that you're competent enough to do, and there's code of ethics and all of that, and those things need to be in place. But I think that thing that fuels that message that we're not enough and we need to go out and get more information from someone else who has more information versus offering something from the heart and lived
mhm,
experience
mhm,
and knowing what the scope of practice is, right? And um I think that's the thing that I'm curious about these days.
mhm. Yeah, that really speaks to me. I was working with a teacher for a long time, and I was that person who was like, "I need to take another class. I need to
Mhm.
take another
Mhm.
class." And then this teacher and I feel like I completed with
Mhm.
this person, and then I was like a little bit like hanging by myself for a minute, and I was like,
Mhm.
"No, wait, the answers, I
Yeah.
have it. I know." And it was a real indication to like start going
Mhm.
inside. I feel like I still talk to the plants and the trees and
Mhm.
get and source information there,
Mhm.
but it does feel like, okay, stop with the external and
Mhm.
like come inside and
Mhm.
see what
Mhm.
wisdom is there, right? Because I
Mhm.
do think we have everything that we need.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, speaking of Good Work Institute and all the amazing things that they do, they had, Bayo Komolafe come and
Mm.
speak, and he's such an incredible person to resource and his body of work to resource about the way forward being awkward, right?
Mm,
This
mhm,
notion of the cracks containing multitudes, and so the discomfort of the not knowing or trying to fill the space before the space speaks, I think is something that we all do,
mhm,
right? And it's
mhm,
something that I continue to do and just try to create some sort of like counter vortex to that of like, oh, I have an hour, let me go do like 1,000 things. And then
mhm, mhm,
like if there's it's the same and idea of raising children of that boredom and not necessarily orienting toward boredom and needing to hang out there because life is busy and we have time constraints, but I think being with the silence long enough for something else to come
mhm.
through, and I think that that's something we're all working on as a collective.
Mhm, and it feels even more challenging to do that now, right, with all the distractions and everything pulling you out
On
of that, right?
purpose.
Yeah,
Yeah, those
yeah,
15-second clips, those
mhm,
things that, kinda keep us hungry, but, not satiated. We're
mhm,
all so, so hungry for connection in a way that belonging is just as important as food and water and
mhm,
shelter. We know that about our species.
mhm,
Um, and it's like choosing the food that nourishes versus choosing the food that kinda numbs us out or takes us off our path.
mhm.
As you're talking about it, it's making me think of the way people have been disconnected from their intuition.
Mm,
And I wonder if intuition plays a role for
mhm.
you or in the work in general.
Yeah. I always misconstrue fear and intuition. I still
Mhm.
find that to be the hardest thing to discern. Or I wouldn't say always, I would say my more frequently than not, and until um, kind of crossing this threshold into motherhood where that felt very different these past couple of years. But I think what I lean into is my experience as an educator and the way in which I have, there's something I'll demand a plan, especially for my husband. But I need the plan, and I need the plan just to be able to go off script, right? So there's something for me about over time creating the structure, creating the plan, and then in the moment trusting what's happening,
Mhm.
trusting the process, trusting what's coming through, and then feeling so awakened by that and alive. So I think that um, because it was the first time Jeffrey and I were working together, I found myself being like, we're like taking all this time to make the plan, and then I'll like look at Jeffrey and be like, I have to do something. No, we're going to do something different, or maybe the morning of, which we haven't debriefed, so I'm not sure if it works for him. But and Jeffrey is also just so generous, in the space that he holds, and the way in which his Zen practice doesn't ask to manipulate anything. It doesn't ask for
Mm.
anything to happen, right? Where I think a lot of what I was curious about is like, you know, generating something together. So I think the way in which we balanced each other out, at least I'll say, I was greatly appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's to kind of go back to this idea of dying, the big death.
Yeah.
There's and I might be misspeaking, but I think in the Tibetan tradition there is this formal practice that
Yes.
you do
Mm.
to be prepared for the moment of crossing over.
Hmm.
And I know when I did my Kundalini yoga training, um, I don't even remember what it was, but it was like you have to say this mantra when
Hmm.
you're dying so
Hmm.
that you stay in this mindset,
Mm.
that you don't go into a
Mm.
fear-based
Mm.
response
So
to
much
death.
pressure.
Yeah.
Like, am I dying right?
Am I
Yeah.
dying right?
Well, I mean, this is Kundalini, it's Tapa Yogi Bhajan
No,
with
it's not even
problems.
that just only isolated to Kundalini, but yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
but,
Yeah.
there are very sort of masculine patriarchal practices
Mhm.
embedded within cultural traditions, right? So there might be reason, right, to
Yeah.
modify things. But the idea was that you keep like if you practice this mantra daily,
Mm.
it will be within your consciousness. It
Yes.
won't be work to do it
Mhm.
once the moment of death
Mhm.
approaches for you.
Mhm.
And so is there any overlap of that practice in
Mhm.
the practicing dying work that you 2 are doing?
Yeah, I think Jeffrey offered the 5 remembrances as something to kind of come back to, or not I think, but he did. Um, and it's also interesting because we have this idea of what death looks like, once we've crossed over, or what might happen. And I think what we were really offering was certain practices that simulate death, right? So if it's meditation, going through that practice of death and decay, and um, visualizing who might be around, or going through practices that invite you to contemplate. You have a year, you have 6 months, you have 3 months, like writing your list of to do and to not do. And that was a practice that was offered to me on a residency in November with two incredible people. And um, I found myself like kind of collecting these offerings over the past many years of like, oh, this fits, like this has a home within
Mhm.
this series. um there's a Tabadachi's practice of writing down, attachments, and then one by one kind of releasing them, and going into corpse pose. So there are ways in which we were um, creating experiences for people over time to just be with that idea. And it really is an idea, right?
Mhm.
We can be in practice, and we can also, there is also this invitation of bringing in textiles and creating a representation of your body so that there's, if you wanted to sit bedside versus being the body that's lying down, to give some
Mm.
choice as to how deep you might want to go with each practice. But I think the curiosity that I've been moving with, at least um, for the past year now, has been around making like life as art, and art as life, right? So these practices that kind of come in that might feel more on the creative plane, like that is the way we drop into play. That is the way we can kind of get work indirectly with something, so we're not contemplating death within this body and kind of bracing to it. We're playing with this thing off to the side, and we have more kind of capacity to um to be curious and to be a little bit more free about how we approach these concepts.
Mhm. Mhm. It feels all very uncomfortable, right?
Mm,
Like this whole idea.
mm,
And I know that you talk about how in that discomfort or
mm,
the uncomfortability or the tension is like where there is
mm,
some expansion, or I don't know exactly how you would describe it, but can you talk a little bit about how your work
mm,
and discomfort
mm.
kind of fit
Yeah,
together? And
totally. I don't think discomfort is necessary. I think
mm-hmm,
the way that discomfort was introduced, was even on the third day, we invited to people like to come through a different door. And
mm-hmm,
instead of sitting, they came into a room where they were standing. And I think that kind of discomfort is like this, there became a rhythm the first two times.
mm-hmm,
We came in through this door and we sat down and we did this thing. And um there's just like a little bit to turn it on its head, right? So that there's there might be awareness in a different way, right? So that part of us that kind of gets used to comfort because we're humans, like we're like,
mm-hmm,
oh, we do
mm-hmm,
this thing, um, in a way where we don't know
mm-hmm,
what's happening. And I think the not knowing, at least for me, is where the discomfort can be,
mm-hmm,
or the breaking the habitual pattern. But it's also the thing that I really long for.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is going to perhaps go in a different direction. But the first thing that I thought of when you were talking about like changing the routine
Mm,
is how you work with children.
mhm,
And,
mhm.
it's been told to me that routine is so important
Yes,
for children.
yes.
And so much so that, like, everything becomes a new routine with
Mhm,
my almost 4-year-old,
mhm,
even
mhm,
the bad things, right? It's like,
mhm.
"No, I yell at you before we go to bed. That's the new
That's
routine."
what that's what we're doing.
Yeah,
Oh god, if I
and
could tell you about bedtime last night, that would be yeah.
and so I sometimes think to myself, am I like, is he becoming too dependent on
Mhm.
routine where he is inflexible and
Yeah,
can't learn to go with the flow? Is there an age?
yeah.
Not to say that you need to have the answers to this, but I know you have a
Great.
child
No.
similar age, and
Yeah,
you think about that.
I do think about it. Yeah, I think also as an educator, like, yes, there's so much benefit to routine because it allows for a lighter lift, right, than when we're reinventing a wheel all the time. And I think the same for artistic practice. Um, I have a little over 3, 3-year-old at home, and the way that routine has supported us, I think, is also the way in which it can be destabilizing for the rest of for the adults in the space,
Yeah.
right? And I think those are the things that at least I spent a lot of time thinking about when he was younger around sleep. And, it's like I think at a certain point, um, like the sticking to the nap schedule, when it becomes like harder to
Mhm,
do than
Mhm.
actually to be like, well, you're not going to take a nap,
Yeah.
right? And I think so much of that being stretched in motherhood, of being like, okay, are we a family that's sticking to routine for the sake of whatever that might be, or are we kind of like going to do what we're going to do and our child would kind of follow along? Um, yeah, and I think each age is very different in the way in which they respond to routine. I find myself like what's been, and I don't know where I learned this. I think it was I don't know if it was a book or if it was listening to a podcast, but there was an invitation, maybe it was a book, but there was an invitation to kind of make these like preview books with your children. So um we were going to be leaving. We were in Norway visiting my husband's family and we were going to be leaving. And I found myself being like, wow, there's a lot of steps to us leaving, right? We're going to have to say goodbye to our family. We're going to be, driving. We're going to be getting on a plane and all of those things. Like he's asking, like, how many more sleeps? What are we? And
Mm,
so making this little book together of just like, first we're doing this, then we're doing this, then we're doing this, and then finally we'll be home. And he really wanted to keep reading it. Like we were reading it all the time and we were reading it even when we got home to have that touch point into like, oh, this is what happened. So I think maybe what I'm saying is like when yes, I rely on routine, I think there's also a way in which that I rely on like front loading a little bit. So like this is what's going to happen, or I'll ask him like, do you want to hear about the day? This is kind of what our plan is. And sometimes I'll hear I'll hear my son's name is River Soul, but sometimes I'll hear him ask like, what's the plan? We need to make a plan. And I'm like, that's me. Whoa, right? So I think all of it is like there's a lot of time spending being so nervous of damaging my child or, passing on those things that I think I grew up often being asked to go with the flow, which was
mm,
not my innate nature, I'll say.
mhm, mhm,
So
mhm.
I think there was some shame in the rigidity or the inflexibility, but I think that was because I probably could have used some of
Mhm.
this,
Yeah.
in support of transitions.
It makes me think also, we've talked about this, having left the corporate world
Uh-huh.
and then, beginning your life on your own
Yeah.
terms, your own business,
Yeah.
piecing together gig jobs, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you're left to yourself to
Mhm.
figure out
Mhm.
your routine
Totally.
and
Yeah.
how some people can get very frozen
Yeah.
when there isn't the
Yes.
structure of
Yes.
the
Yeah. Institutions are so great for that. I think
yeah.
like
Mhm.
I experienced that when I left full-time work in schools and was freelancing and doing client work and consulting with schools, and realized the limitation of my brain,
Mhm.
of like, wow, this requires so much energy to create this schedule and then also balance the schedule at home. And, you know, there's I think there's a way that we can get free of these systems that offer that structure,
Mhm.
thinking that we'll have more capacity,
Mhm.
and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, how? I don't
Yeah.
have
What do I do?
yeah, and
Yeah.
and like that's cool too.
Mhm.
That's a big growth edge.
Mhm. Yeah. It all it's like bringing up so much, and I love the idea of having a plan and then kind of
Yeah,
throwing it away,
yeah,
right? Like, that's kind of how I operated even in corporate. We would spend months building this huge, like,
totally.
Microsoft plan thing,
Corporate
and then I
theater.
would never look at it again, right? I was like, "Okay, we said we were gonna do all of these things," and you
Yeah.
kind of just get it, and then you are
Mhm.
more in flow inside of it.
Mhm.
And I do think that there's something about routine that's calming to the
Oh, of
nervous system,
course.
right? Like to
Yeah.
know what to expect. But I guess in like your example of come in a different door for this
Mhm.
session, you're still safe, right? Even though it's like a
Yeah.
different thing. And do you think that that helps with expansion of nervous system capacity? Like little things
Mhm.
like that that kind of
Mhm.
throw you off a little
Mhm.
bit, but not so much. So your
Mhm.
system can be like, oh, we did it differently, but we're still
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I think that well, one of the things that I'll say is that we always sent out like a check-in mid session and kind of like this is the agenda, which I
Mm-hmm.
know probably 90% of the people never read, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're just like, oh, it's okay. Like this is just in my inbox. But for folks that felt like they really needed, like I always offer that if you
Yeah.
really need to know what the plan is, right? Um, and then the going through the different door and kind of settling into movement. And the thing that I felt was really cool about that is it allowed for, so there was essentially an invitation to come into the space and um to be, because so much of this, like when we're in a group, we're witnessed, but it's also a lot to be witnessed by a group, and it's also a lot to be witnessed by an individual, right? And I think playing with this idea of witness and intimacy, because essentially that is what we're talking
Mhm.
about, right? Intimacy with self and intimacy with other in the world. And um to come into a movement practice with eyes closed, with another person making sure you're safe, right?
Mhm.
You're not going to bump into someone else or bump into the wall. Um, and just offer for folks that felt okay with some touch, right? So they're moving, their eyes are closed, and the touch is just on a part of the body to originate the movement, right? And then another part of the body, and maybe the movement comes from that point, just to kind of shake up the way that we're used to moving.
Mhm.
Because I think there's ways that we could fall into pattern. I have a dance practice, um and I'll find myself kind of like in the same dance. And I'm like, is this my dance today? Or is this the thing that I'm just going to because it's more comfortable
Mhm.
to move this way? And we can give ourselves internal prompts to be like, okay, what would it be like for my hand to follow, to lead the movement? Um, and that, I think that type of disruption, like when we have, when we feel safe enough
Mhm.
to try something we haven't tried before, um, I think I think that's a really it's such a beautiful
Mhm.
experience when
Mhm.
it's possible, and
Mhm.
we know that it's not possible all of the time.
Mhm.
Right.
I was recently speaking with somebody about, dancing
Mhm,
and how it's so much harder and unpleasant to have to do your own dance
mhm.
versus like following a routine
Mm,
from an
okay.
instructor.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out a way how to articulate the magic that happens when you're not just
Yeah.
following.
Yeah.
And, I was like, it's like you're there's so many things that are happening in that moment, like you're
Mm,
mentioning, like you
mm,
need to feel safe
mm,
in order to do that, right?
mm,
And that's like an interesting just observation alone. Like,
mm,
why don't I feel safe in this moment? I'm
mhm,
not in danger,
mhm,
in a dance room.
mhm,
But also the listening to oneself, like
mhm,
really listening deeply to yourself, which we don't do, I don't think
mhm,
often,
mhm.
many of us, myself included. And then this like connection with just the moment, like where the creativity emerges in the moment.
Yeah.
But I didn't
Yeah.
say it succinctly or eloquently.
I think it's also just getting out of the way, right?
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
dance could be like I've been dancing five rhythms for quite some time, and I find sometimes they're offered like these two waves. You have one wave and then you have a second wave. And I remember when I first started dancing, maybe about 12 years ago, I would dance so hard. I was just like in it. Those first, I don't know, the first half an hour, the class is 2 hours, right? And then I would just blow myself out,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And I was like, "Whoa." And then over time, not realizing how slow I have to go to be able to hear
Mhm.
that thing.
Yeah.
How is it a day that my eyes need to be open? Is it a day my eyes need to be closed? Is there a day where contact is okay versus not? And then in the dance that's like difficult, can that just be the dance, right? Can it just
Mhm.
be like, I hate this dance, right? Like, this is how I'm moving. This is this, and then it changes,
Yeah.
right? That has never been my experience that the full 2 hours is I hate this dance, right? Like
Mhm.
something will shift.
Mhm.
And I think what we're also talking about, like this is the constraint and flow. Like we need both. We need structure and we need freedom. We
Mhm.
need, it's like if you were to plop me in a room with like no structure and just be like, yeah,
Mhm.
have a great time. And then you're like, and that might not be true for all bodies, but
Mhm.
I do find to whatever range of needs, like there is benefit in both, and that can take shape in different ways.
Mhm. Jennifer and I like to refer to that as the masculine and the feminine, but we're
Yes,
trying to get away from
sure.
that.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, yes, yin and yang.
Yeah.
This is like, I've been holding that too. Like there's a practice, walking the eight that was offered to us. And, when I say us, we were in New Mexico on an artist residency, and um, Nico Wolf was one of the facilitators, and Melissa Word, and they're incredible. And so this walking of the eight, which is really like holding polarity, right, and crossing through the midline. And we did this on the in the series too, of walking life and death, right, and then what's in the center. But this all of these other ideas that populated, we kind of worked on. We made this map of kind of a line down the center, life and death on each side, but like all the different ways that that takes shape. Um and then offering folks the opportunity to just walk that path. Like what is center for you? Um but when I came in before we started recording, and we were talking about making decisions as a family, and I think there's always this like theory versus practice, but I think what I'm currently like, well, what if, knowing that there's polarity everywhere, what if this orientation toward at least relationship, which can often be, it's like I've had so many of those fights with my partner around polarity of what I need and what he needs to be for me to be able to be that. And but like, what if there was freedom on both sides, right? So what if we're walking the eight, and both of those is freedom on either end,
Yeah.
right? Which I think for me felt different, because as crossing through the midline of being like, oh, like this is the place of alive poems, right? Like this place that we cross through. This is life
Yeah.
in its artful form, where we're not relying on sacrifice for the other to be whatever it is. Yeah, it's my my current weekly music.
Yeah.
So would you describe
I'll come back next week and be like, no, it
that's
doesn't
not
work.
it.
Yeah.
Would you say the middle part is the balance or the absence, or how would you?
I'm when my husband and I first met, we had a moment where we were listening to a story about a Mobius strip, and it was like he made a Mobius strip for me. I'm like
I don't know
so
what that
emotional
is.
when he's like, no, it's sweet, out of electrical tape. But it was it's basically, I'm not going to explain it properly because I don't know what he knows about it, but I see it as this.
It's
Right?
a figure eight form.
It is.
It's in 3 dimensions.
Thank you.
It sort of moves, like there's a different way to, I don't know you could probably go deep with the form. Ironically, it was my first logo when I was going to be doing corporate meditation work, which never happened.
Yeah.
But that was my
Is
first
it like the
logo.
infinity?
Yeah,
sign?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it was this idea of like, whatever, I'm moving away from the idea of infinity, but more of, and this was also in kind of contemplation of like, I want new vows and I want a different wedding ring, and I don't want like this idea of a circle, right? This kind of like, we're in this loop. And there was something that felt in my body so freeing about considering the shape, because it also allowed space for us to like, maybe I could be here and he could be here, and then we meet each other, or we're both traveling in the same direction, or we're moving in opposite direction. But I think at least there's a feeling of more spaciousness than there is in kind of like closed loop circle. And I think each of them have, so much beauty in their own form. But yeah.
Yeah. It's the yin yang too, right? Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was moderating a conversation with Eliza Swan, who's an alchemist, and Susan Aberth, who's a history professor at Bard. And in Susan's forward to Eliza has a new book, The Alchemical Imagination. And one of the things that Eliza, I'd interviewed them twice on my former radio show. And one of the things that's just like stands out in my head is that when I would ask them a question, it was like, and both.
Yes.
Yes. Just so many questions. And I was just like, okay,
Yes.
my brain wants a firm answer, but
Totally.
I'm getting this. And Susan's forward just sort of recognizes how Eliza's book really brings out the non-binary of the world, and how alchemy in general, Hermes Trismegistus, right, I think was like a non-binary figure, right? And how we are in this world where the non-binary is really becoming, part of the regular conversation, and how that all folds into this same sort of understanding of balance, or
Yeah.
both, or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean it's one of the things we touch into when I offer relational education in schools, and what that's kind of become is a nervous system based comprehensive sex education.
Mm.
That's over a series that is social justice oriented and arts based, and I've been playing with this curriculum for the past 3 years or so, and the way in which we can lay the foundation of like nervous system as the baseline before even approaching what we're taught about puberty and binary and bodies and what happens, right? And the the thing that keeps blowing my mind is as as there's more um as well, there's more research on my part, but also just the beautiful work that other communities are doing to, despite being erased on websites and
Mhm.
bodies, no longer being allowed in the conversation. Um, the so much of this, even sex diversity in nature, right? Where there's so many organisms that are not in the binary, that like just don't, that's not even a thing. Um, and the way that this has been since the beginning of time, right? And so I think that it's curious, like the things that come into mainstream that we might like perk up around and think that it's maybe the first time it's happening.
Mm.
And I don't remember if you at the Green Burial talks that were happening for
I
Lesser
didn't
Mysteries,
go,
but I thought
no.
one of the greatest things was just like the history of burial in the United States. So if we're like looking at history for like this long, long timeline, and the ways in which what we think is happening right now is the norm,
Right.
and we zoom out far enough and being like, whoa, this has been the norm for 150 years. Before that, this was happening, right? Which might be having a resurgence. But I think like trusting the magic that's starting to come in and populate in, um not in mainstream culture, but like coming in as like divine information that
Mm.
maybe we should be paying attention to.
Mhm. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about how the child's brain, I mean, I'm not a child psychiatrist or
Neither am
biologist,
I.
but I just know that it's sometimes just, I'm like, how do you not understand,
Mm,
that I can't do something because I'll be at work. Like, it's just it seems so clear to me to
yeah.
orient a certain way, but it's almost like his brain is just like anything's possible,
Yeah.
Everything can be happening at the same time. But society is constantly reinforcing this notion of like, no,
Yeah.
there's rules and structures, and this
Hmm.
is how it all works together.
Yeah.
And yes, there's a reason that it's helpful to know the structures
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
the universe,
hmm
but then there's something that's lost in that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. I wonder about that. I've been I've been like, do I, those visual timers that can be, and I was like, do I want to introduce this? Because there's a way in which time doesn't exist
Yeah.
for him right now.
Yeah,
And like, why would I impose time in such a concrete way if
right.
it's not something that's there for him?
Yeah.
And yeah, this idea of like kairos and chronos. So if we're thinking about linear time versus when it might be feeling like timelines are collapsing on themselves,
Mhm.
and both of those again being true. I think the way in which capitalist models kind of build on the like the chronological time, and maybe we get a taste of freedom from that when we leave corporate world, or we kind of step out of an institution or a structure, but we find we also might need some structure, right? So um, yeah, this balance between form and chaos right?
Yeah.
And
Can you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing in schools and
sure.
how that started
Yeah.
and what you're up to?
hmm Um, how did it start? I don't know if I I think so. Maybe I'll start with when I maybe I think it was around 2020 because it was during the time of at least the height of the pandemic, um, where I felt like my work in schools was feeling a bit untenable
What were you
for
doing at
some
the time?
for
For some reason,
for some
I don't know
reason.
why.
So I'm an educator, childhood educator. My master's is in special education behavioral disorders. So for a long time, I worked with kids in that
Mhm,
practice and ended up at this incredible school that was outside of the public school system that I had been working in that was, again, arts, social justice based. And um, I I started thinking a little bit about like what trauma informed education could look like,
mm,
especially during the pandemic. Like, what are we doing? How are we creating that safety on a screen? Right? Everybody is frightened, and it was introduced to somatic experiencing through my own trauma therapy that I was doing at the time, and I moved toward that program. Yes, with the curiosity of trauma informed education, but also with my own background of my growing up and really wanting to call in a child and feeling like I don't I don't know what my home would look like if I don't work on some of these things beyond like, decades of therapy and all of the things. But I didn't understand it at the time moving towards something that was like a professional training so that I could become a parent. Like it was one of those things of like,
mhm,
I need to train to do this thing. Um, but I think trusting the greater intelligence there of really wanting these like body-based practices beyond just yoga and meditation, um, to start to find their way into the education system. And when I had my son, I wasn't working full time and I had that's a whole nother conversation around what postpartum looked like. But I kind of returned to this idea of how, because there's a lot of effort spent in scope of practice, and I had so much imposter syndrome going through the somatic experiencing training and coming out on the other end. My work was never with adults. My work was always with children. Um, and I was like, how do I fit into
mhm,
this like wellness model, the mental health model? I had my own kind of experiences as a teenager, working with mental health professionals because of my own um, childhood experiences. And so I didn't feel like I had a seat at the table. And slowly starting to see those two things knitting together, like that piece felt really alive for me to return to and thinking about how how to orient going through a massive transition that's visible to a lot of the world at a time where you want to be invisible, right? So a lot of the work just came from like stirring the pot and starting to kind of play with this idea. And middle way school is a school that I have a wonderful relationship with, and there's a lot of trust there. So they allowed me, the latitude to do that there. And um just an incredible community, and same at Catskill Montessori doing that as well. And little different at each. I think also just knowing, for folks that don't know, in New York there's no mandated sex ed. So in New York City, there is, mandated comprehensive sexual education.
mhm,
Um, Once you start looking at the map of the United States, you'll see where there's no sex education happening,
mhm,
and knowing that each county will have their own
mm,
jurisdiction, and so. Uh, both schools very different, but how they were orienting to some of the, looking at the national standards of sex education, um, what might feel provocative for one community feels essential for another.
Mhm.
So I think over time, both of those programs kind of built out in a different way and landed in what feels like a uh, it feels whole in the sense that I feel so much of myself in the offering,
Mhm.
um, in the way in which, like, we are talking about reproductive justice. We are talking about, um, being with artists who have in their lifetime uh, played with this idea of embodiment, right? And yeah, it's something that I feel really really passionate about.
How old are the kids that you're working
K
with?
through 8.
Okay.
Mhm.
So you have a different
Mhm.
stages, right,
Mhm.
as they're going through
Mhm.
the program. I
Mhm.
don't remember having sex education. Do you remember having
I
it?
think I did in I can remember the room I was in, which is
I
Mhm.
insane,
totally think
and
I
the
can
TV
too.
and the
Yeah.
VCR.
Yeah.
I remember that. I think it was high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember anything until college.
Mine was middle school.
Yeah.
I was definitely in a middle school. Yeah. And
Mhm.
I don't really remember the content of it, but
Mhm.
yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating to think about the way education is being modified, manipulated. I don't know how you want to describe it. And how it's very refreshing to hear that there
Mm.
aren't like national standards that have to
Mhm.
be imposed on schools when it
Mhm.
comes to this type of
Mhm.
education.
Mhm.
Because if that were the case, I mean,
Mhm.
maybe it is in public schools, but you're saying in New
Mm.
York State, maybe it's not
Well,
mandated?
not excuse me, there's no mandated schools aren't mandated to teach sex ed,
Okay.
right? The national standards are actually quite, they're quite incredible. If they were incorporated
Mhm.
into every school, that would be, like, great.
Mhm.
But the fact that that's not the case, and I
Mhm.
and I don't know necessarily, um yeah, I'm like I just the idea of more, and this is not a new idea, right? But like the politiciz like bodies being politicized,
Right.
right? Where if I don't know if the solution would be mandating that to be implemented across the country and communities where children would be rendered unsafe, right?
Yeah.
So I can only speak for this small community
Yeah.
that I am privileged enough to be doing this work in.
How do the kids respond? Like, do they have
Yeah. I think
questions?
when they
Mhm.
hear it's different. I think that there's, I think this notion of puberty, I noticed everybody kind of goes into a freeze mod. So it's like you're here to talk about what with what? Um, and I think one of the ways, like, we don't get to it for some schools, it's a 6 session model, and so we don't even get to puberty until session 5, right? There's ways in which we're kind of like just learning to be together in a group. We're
Mhm.
talking about things that feel less provocative, and also, quite frankly, a little bit more interesting. And um, before getting to what puberty could look like in a body, there's also the invitation to have a parent interview, so they kind of have a script where they they can just be in conversation, right? So it's opening the door for parents to if they so choose, right, to be in dialogue. And some of that work is also coming from this idea of like sex positive families and what that looks like, and families, how we think of the definition of like sexual health, or the definition of health, of sexual health, of um the opportunities that we have as parents to start to teach consent just around, putting your child to bed and like, let me know when you want me to stop rubbing your back,
Mhm.
right? Or how would you like me to rub your back? Um, where, it's we can easily say that sexuality starts when we're born and ends when we die. So if that's the case, right, how is that? being even considered in a family unit.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to
Mm-hmm.
think about.
Mm.
I, the thought that's coming up, not to say that you're going to have an answer for it, but why there's such a freeze response when we talk about these things. And even,
Mm-hmm.
as a young, you know, 3-year-old, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like the goofiness that happens when certain body parts are visible.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, I try to be very just like stoic about everything. We actually, I'm gonna say this out loud, but
Yeah.
took a bath together
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
other night,
I do that too.
and and it was, at first he was kind of giggly, but then it just became funny that he was pouring water on my head,
Yeah.
But it really is just like, when does it become a freeze response?
Mm.
Because kids are
Mm.
aware of this
Mm-hmm.
part of themselves
Mm-hmm.
and their potential desire for
Mm-hmm.
another person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm. I think I'm just like, oh yeah, like taking a bath together has just been I mean, we've been taking baths together for his whole life. So I think
mm,
feeling the way that um has changed, right? I think
mm,
that when I was nursing and he would want to nurse in the bath, or, and now how he will like pretend to nurse, or sometimes he won't ask at all, right?
yeah,
Like different parts of my body might get more attention than just my breasts because he's not into mama milk anymore.
yeah,
Um, but I don't know, because it's still one of those, like, it's every time, like, does this feel okay to take a bath together for
mhm,
me? Like there
mhm,
might be a time where he's like, no,
yeah,
right? And I think like it is just about that deeper listening. Like there's so much information that comes from, you know, developmental research, and we know when, imagination kicks in, like all of these things,
mhm,
and we could easily be looking at that as our timeline,
yeah,
or we can start to just be curious about what's in the field and
yeah,
like responding to that, which for me at this time feels more accurate.
yeah,
And I think that that's like an edgy thing to do as a parent, and it's
yeah,
also really cool.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to belabor the issue, but he hasn't wanted to take a bath with us in a while. And
Uh-huh.
then just recently it started. So now
Yeah.
every night he wants it.
Yes.
I feel terrible, but I don't like to take a bath. I
Yes.
want to be fully immersed in the warm water. I don't want to be sitting out.
It has just up to your hips,
Right.
and
Yeah.
like it's cold.
Yeah.
I know. I feel the same way. I'll do it. I can do like 5 solid minutes when I'm enjoying it. And then I'm like, and there's sand. Somehow sand has gotten in the bath from there's toys in there. He pees in the bath
Yeah.
before, and I'm like, this is not like, I don't really want to hang out in here anymore. But like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So
My baths are so different.
Jennifer is like lighting a candle with essential oil. I
Putting
wanna
some mug.
I was like, I'll come here and take a bath at your house.
I will not go to your house. and
No,
take a bath.
no one wants the pee in the sand. No, I get that. Respect.
Well, and I'm realizing now that one of the things that I don't really do with him, I talk, and not to make it about children, but children are an interesting lens, I think, to like look
Yeah.
at the
I'll also
world.
say like that's also in us. All the
Right,
like we
right.
have that 3-year-old, that 4-year-old, that
Mhm,
5-year-old. So
right.
yeah, I think
Mhm.
it's important to talk about children too.
Yeah. Um, we often talk about, how are you feeling? Lately, he's been asking over and over again, are you happy? Are you happy? Are you happy?
River's been doing that
It must
too.
be
Really?
Oh my
develop-
gosh. We need a fourth guest to tell us why. Oh my goodness. Yes.
But what I don't do, and I'm realizing as I'm talking to you, is I don't ask, like, what is he feeling in his body? Like, if he gets
Uh-huh.
an ouchie,
Yeah.
right, then I ask, how are you feeling? Where
Yeah.
does it hurt? What do you need?
Yeah.
But I don't ask him
Mm.
regularly about that.
Mm.
And I wonder if that's part of your work with the school and how you help kids feel
Yeah.
their bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the invitation to discuss feelings is like, it's there's I think there's a way in which it can be intrusive, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I think working with children in the same way, like there's been this overcorrection of pronouns, right? And I've heard children, if we're coming together and we're sharing our pronouns each and every time, there's some groups of children where I've heard been like, I don't know anymore, right?
Mhm.
Like it's become this
Mm.
thing that we're constantly asking that
Mhm.
doesn't always allow for the privacy of it shifting or changing for
Yeah.
whatever reason, right? So I think when we're constantly in that conversation around feelings, it can be counterproductive. And I'm trying to think of like when I'll ask River. I mean, when he asks if I'm happy, I always have this shame of like, no, I'm not happy at this moment. And then I'm like, do I look depressed? Why is he asking this?
Oh.
Right. And then I'll be like, no.
Yeah.
No, but also that's okay. Like,
Yeah.
I think I'm just
Mhm.
like, it's okay to be, neutral or sad or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the language that we have around feelings changes over time. So I always like to show this kind of infographic of activation in the body and different association, like different feeling associations. So if we can relate to sensation as activation, and this particular infographic is like a heat map. So it's cold and hot, and you can see where the body experiences activation as heat. So if I think one of the images for joy or for love, like there's activation through the whole body, but it's hot, right?
Mhm.
Whereas depression, it might be the legs and the arms are cold. So all the body kind of brings the energy toward the center. So we can sometimes feel like heavy or cold in our limbs. And so instead of necessarily being in the feelings place, we can be in the curiosity of sensation,
Mhm.
and that sensation giving us information about what we might need. And then learning what that need is so that we can make that request, and that request so we can maybe come to a different agreement.
Mhm.
That's actually sensation is the word I was looking for. And I'd be curious to know, are you showing them these images? But my worry is, right, that I'm
Mm,
imposing sort of an expectation by
sure.
showing them an image,
Hmm.
but certainly it can be helpful
Yeah.
because sensation, and unless there's an ouchie, right,
Mm,
it's hard to
mm,
Mhm.
notice sensation.
yeah.
So just how you do that, if you're
Yeah.
talking about sensations and explaining that to
Yeah.
them.
I think anytime I use image, it's always a question of what do you notice, right? Or what
Mhm.
are you curious about? There's one, I think it's shame, where the face on the infographic looks like Spider-Man because of the way that the heat moves through the body. And that always kind of is a thing where they're like, oh, this, or I see
Mm.
this. And I think it's
Interesting.
just to offer a different lens where um there I think we speaking about habits, right? Like we learn to move away from discomfort um and toward the thing that might, whether it's a dopamine hit or pleasure or whatever. Um and and if we're talking about wanting to center pleasure in the things that feel good, it's important to know, like, what does your yes feel like? How do you know? What does your no feel like? How do you know what does maybe feel like? Um, to start to have that conversation happening from inside versus like, oh, I should say yes because I see all these other
Mhm.
people doing it.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
And
For
then we
sure.
we abandon self, right?
Mhm.
And so I think just like maybe it's just being in the business of like map making, right? So we're like, oh, your body is an encyclopedia with so much
Mhm.
wisdom that you already have, and you just need to like be given the space and time to learn its language, which could be this feeling that I have in my belly.
Mhm.
And for you, it might be a feeling that you have in your throat, right? And it just is an indication of slowing down and being like, what's happening here,
Mhm.
right?
I feel like adults need this
Yeah,
information too.
I need it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so incredible to me that it's happening
Mm,
in a small pocket or maybe
yeah.
other pockets too in schools. It just feels even more important than some of the stuff that we're
Mm,
always kind
yeah.
of like following the curriculum and learning because when like this idea of finding your yes and finding your no was only something that I became aware of when I was in my Reiki training. Someone brought this like in 2019, right? So I was in my 40s and I was like, oh, I can sense it in my body.
Yeah.
And it was like mind blowing to
Yeah.
me, right? And now I use it all the time. But I just think it's so incredible to,
Yeah.
if you grow up with this language and with this ability or whatever you want to call it, or awareness maybe is what it is. Like the whole world can change.
Yeah, I believe that fully.
Yeah.
And I also think that there's a way that, at least for the older kids, to be in dialogue around like checking in and checking out, right? So if we have an awareness of like, what are ways that we check out,
Mhm.
right? What are ways that we can check in? And what if it's the same thing, right? What if we can use the same experience to check in or out? I think it's just bringing awareness to like the kind of the pause before the response.
Mhm.
It's the awareness of like, I'm doing this thing, and then just having the opportunity to choose it,
Mhm.
right? Rather than go by default.
Mhm.
Um, I think yeah, that's
Yeah.
mhm,
It's amazing.
mhm.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Mm,
Yeah, I'm thinking about what we talked about in our last time together when it was just me and you and talking about anger, right? And like how
mm,
you are reacting to anger or helping Aiden with his anger and what you
mhm,
do with that and the
Mhm.
reactivity versus
mhm,
responding,
mhm.
right? Like that's a whole.
Yeah. I was practicing this weekend uh with this wonderful teacher, and I I was practicing it I had an opportunity to go on retreat with a friend, and uh in one of the yoga practices we were allowed to take the first like 20 minutes, and we were just dancing, and it was incredible, at least for me. And then I felt this feeling come, and I was like, oh no, I'm gonna cry. And
Mhm.
then I can like feel even like the yeah, in my eyes as I'm talking about it, not because of the like, it was just something needed to move.
Mhm.
And I found myself like, do I go outside?
Mhm.
No one else was crying, and I was
Mhm.
like, ah. Um, and I was like moving through it because I know how to do that, and go to our mat to practice, and it just comes again,
Mhm.
right? And she came over, and it was just the sweetest, like, and even more so, like, we know we kind of like bring the palm of the hand to the heart. But she touched me with the back of her hand, which felt like there was so much like we weren't merging, right? She was like just giving me the presence
Mhm.
of like, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
And she said, like, it's all movement. And I
Mhm.
was like, oh,
Wow.
just permission,
Mhm.
right? That it's all movement. Um, and then it moved,
Mhm.
right? And I think that even the way we can talk about anger in like that heat map, right? That kind of the infographic that I was referring to, seeing it as energy, right? And what does energy need to do? It needs to move.
Mhm.
And so anger in particular, some of us have more fire in our system than others. Like uh, and the ways that we can potentially support bodies that need to move anger. I think it's always that ask of like, is this a like proportionate response to what's happening? Um, and especially now when we're talking about like so much of what's happening in our world, igniting this part of us that's like, no, this is not okay. And that is a proportionate response to what's happening. So it might not be about going to the steady breath. It might be
Mhm.
about like moving that to get to the place where you can come with a little bit more organization in the system. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Your um dance experience, whether or not I don't know what
Mm,
was moving through you, but it made me think about grief. And
yeah.
I feel like
It was like, yes. Yes, it was some of that.
Oh, I was just thinking, what did I just do? I must have just had something with somebody. I don't know what I did. Or maybe it was drumming on Monday night. I
Mm,
don't know. But
mm,
something has been, there's been this deep awareness that like at any moment I could just burst out in
yeah.
Mhm.
tears. And somebody was trying to suggest, I'm like, I can't remember who this person was, but they were trying to suggest that it had to do with, it's my therapist. That it had to do with like inner child something that I had experienced. And I was like, I feel like it's related to Aiden. Like, you know, and part of me was like, you might be right, but like done a lot of work on my inner child. Like, you know, not to say that there isn't always work there, but I was like, it's gotta be, I feel like it's just related to Aiden or the many miscarriages that I have that I'm projecting like loss onto him. And but how I haven't given myself the opportunity to just like unleash. Not unleash with rage, but like just to let it all out as my eyes are watering now. And I cry on the show like whenever I want to, but um but it's interesting to me about why I don't give myself the time to do it other than, you know, I'm fairly busy and overwhelmed with life and to like do that is, you know, maybe not a priority for some reason. But it makes me think about grief and how grief is also connected to death. And I feel like I didn't hear from you the things that you offer to folks in exploring their grief, whether it's with the practicing dying or in any other ways that it comes up for you. And so I'd just be curious about what your relationship is to grief and how you honor it or work with it.
I think I'm like, I don't know when my body hasn't. I feel like I was born with a lot of grief,
Yeah.
you know? Like, I think that there's that reality. Um, and like also I just wanted to name too, like going back to speaking about children, there's a way in which if we're not told it's not our fault, we internalize it as it being us, right? And there's this the the at least the hope in offering the relational education is like everything is normal, right? We're coming out of pathology and stigmatization in a way that like this whole scope is normal, whether we're talking about sex diversity, we're talking about feelings, or we're talking about um and the grief. I thought it was for the longest time, like carrying it around was my like it was almost like a backpack, right? Like internal backpack. Um that with some contract, you know, of just like this is also paying like homage to all of the loss. Um and not experiencing like the transmutation of grief and what's available there, like this alchemy that you're talking about. Um, and the and speaking about like the time and the luxury that um of feeling the feeling, I think what brought me to my knees was my pregnancy and the birth of my son, where yes, I had done all this work and it was like a perfect storm for all of it to come back up. And there there was a way that I I really fell apart. Like I went down, like we talked about, like a honest descent, like down, down, um, and sought support to kind of like make sure that I could still function as a mother and you know be available to my child. But I that took me 8 months to be willing to take. Right. And I was so concerned with the trauma of the birth. You know, it's like coming from the somatic world and being like, how do I metabolize this so that it's not passed on to my child or it's not something that gets stuck in my body? And anytime I tried to move toward it, like it wasn't time, right? I would just feel like something else would come up. Um and it was in allowing like the falling apart and the reorganization and the restructuring for something else. I had no idea, right? I I think it was the most recent experience was, in this experience, Grief Threads, with Melissa Word, who, um, is an artist and an amazing person, but, um, we were I had never made a quilt before, but I was like, I do this now." And always with textiles, but, like, I didn't know how to sew, and, um, kind of going going through this process of, um it was my 41st birthday, and I made a call out to friends asking for them to send me, items of, like, fabric, right? Or, poems or memories of me so that I could remember myself.
Mhm.
And, I read it back and I was like, "You're so dramatic." It was, like, being so dramatic, but
Mhm.
I needed something to feel like this is, like, the indirect work, to, like, feel the putting the pieces together in a different way, because I felt that internally,
Mm.
but I didn't know what this new version was. I was, like, in the process of transformation, really seeking something to touch.
Mhm.
And, I received fabric, and I kinda laid it out as if it were a quilt, but I didn't sew it together, and ended up in this experience with Melissa and another group of people, and I had my hospital gown from when I gave birth to my son, and we were invited to begin to, like, dismember these pieces, and, like, with the seam ripper, kind of, like, taking each part apart, and it's like hospital gowns, how many people have worn them over time, and finding, like, lint and threads on the collar and the seam, and just the freedom of, like, ripping this piece
Mm.
apart, of not only what it represented for me, but, like, other people's stories, and, um, I have, like, chills talking about it, but there
Yeah.
was something about, like, releasing original form to be made something new.
Yeah.
Mm.
And there were certain items that I could not take apart. Like, I have my father who, he passed away when I was 29, and had, like, a whole vision of that happening, and, um, tragic, like, really intense tragic loss, and I couldn't take apart his, uh his denim shirt, and when my son was born, I wore that shirt every day, and we had a very complicated relationship, so it wasn't, um it's not like a clean story in that way, and that was okay, like, I
Mhm.
couldn't take that one
Yeah.
apart,
Yeah.
but, like, that in its full structure allowed me to take other things apart,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that, that experience of, like, being with grief in a tangible way, that is that is artful,
Mhm.
because we are here to make beauty,
Yeah.
right? And that willingness to, like, meet the grief in that way also brings exponential joy. And I think I kept a ceiling and a floor for a
Mhm.
long time to stay on the middle path, because I really didn't trust the falling apart, right? I didn't trust, um going rogue and going a complete different direction, and that kind of control, not as supportive structure, right? That kind of control that you start feeling your head, like, hitting the ceiling, um, could have continued, right? And I'm really grateful that it didn't.
Mhm.
What I'm hearing from
Mm,
you is I am interpreting as finding the place to have hope.
mm,
But I don't know if that was your
yeah,
experience. And so does
mm,
hope work into
yeah,
that process at all, or is it something else? Like, that's what
yeah,
I'm naming it as
yeah.
because
I I'm not sure. I'm also realizing there was a part of the initial question that I didn't answer, as far as, like, the practicing death piece that I wanna go back to, but I think, and Francis Weller talks about this too, like, grief, at least in a communal ritual, like, we cross a threshold, and we kind of return to our community, um, having been witness crossing that threshold, and as changed. And I think one of the things in motherhood is so much of it is invisible. Or we had lived in the city for a long time, came up here, and this massive decay of self was happening in this house that nobody was really witnessing. My community wasn't necessarily witnessing in the way, and I didn't know how to communicate it. Um, I don't know in that time that I felt hope. I felt desperation, um, which maybe, yeah, there's a link there. Um, I I'm also trying to explore like my relationship to even the word hope and what
Mhm.
that means. And I don't think of it as delusion, or I don't think of it as kind of like a pat on the head. I think
Yeah.
it's essential. And I think that if we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to carry on. Um, but maybe more focused on action in the way. I mean, I guess yeah, in some ways it's like waking up every morning. There had to have been some hope. Otherwise, why would we keep doing it? But yeah, I want to think a little bit more about that.
I interviewed a woman, Joanne Stevelos, who I'm like, "Oh, yeah, you talked about this once before," because hope is a tricky
Mm,
concept,
hmm.
and just putting it in here, we don't have to discuss it further, but
Yeah.
she studied with somebody who has something called the hope model, I think,
Okay.
and it is like this, if I remember correctly, um a way she herself is a childhood sexual assault
Hmm.
survivor and was working with children in that
Hmm.
community,
Hmm.
and I think this model was sort of derived out of that, like,
Mm,
how do you move forward?
hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's almost like a way of practicing hope
Mm,
Mm.
is the way I'm remembering it
yeah.
and, like, succinctly
Yeah.
describing it. So, just plopping that in there for
Mm.
to marinate and
I love the idea
wherever.
of practicing hope.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'll link to it in
Yeah.
the show notes just if anybody wants a reference for it.
Hmm.
But you wanted to go back
Hmm.
to the practicing dying.
Yeah, I think if initially maybe you had asked how that comes into
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
series. Um, the way the second session that we did that was around grief. Um, I think one of the things Jeffrey and I spoke about was a way to um, give permission for people to share the threads that they're carrying, right? And the grief that they're carrying. There was also curiosity around how that grief takes shape in your body, right? Color, texture, shape, all of the things. Um, and just the invitation of like putting all of that in a bowl and passing it around, and other people giving voice to other folks writing. It's always so beautiful to hear
Mhm.
someone else
Mhm.
speak your words, to start to knit together what what's in the shared space. um, and that that session in particular was the one where we also came to this the Tabadachi ceremony and writing our attachments, and it's kind of offered in the sense of uh, three people, three sensory experiences, kind of reflecting on your passing and those closest to you, or the things like the like the wind touching your skin, right? Like these places where we really hold so dear, and then releasing them one at a time, right? And you can even feel it like as I'm speaking, like the contemplation of it brings up like, oof,
Yeah.
there's so much there. Um, and I think that when we're with our grief, it also points us toward the direction of life,
Mm.
right? So going back to those things that you might have written on those pieces of paper being as like that's those are your touch points, right? And rather gripping to keep them super close, right? There's the opportunity to be like, how do I want to be in relationship while I'm here? Um, yeah.
I have a more back to basics somatic
Mhm,
question based on all the things that you're saying, where you're talking about walking the 8, right?
mhm,
You're talking about the process of touching the fabrics and
mm,
taking them apart, and this more tangible, embodied, maybe kind
mhm,
of way of existing or practicing things. Because I think a lot of the world is still like, "Oh, if I go to talk therapy and I figure it
mhm,
out in my head and talk
mhm,
about it, then the mental part will get
mhm,
figured out." And
mhm,
there's not necessarily,
mhm.
I think it's shifting, but I feel like there's not necessarily a lot of
Yeah.
focus on the energetic part, on the physical part of how that's interconnected. So can you maybe talk about, from your perspectives, the importance of
Mhm.
that? I'm just thinking about the first time I did a family constellation
Uh-huh.
where you're kind of standing as bodies
Yes.
represent, and I was representing another person's scene and story.
Yeah.
So you're the person's mother and you move in a certain way in the circle. I was like, "This is what I don't like. What is this family constellation
And then
thing?
you
Why am I?"
cry.
And then yeah,
Like,
and then
"Why
you
am I
go and do it,
crying?"
and you're like, "Wow, I knew exactly where to go and
Yes.
what to do."
Yes.
And the power of it
Yeah.
just like blew my mind. I was like, "How is the idea that of
Yeah.
something that we've talked about forever and ever,
Mhm.
and now we're standing in a circle with strangers,
Mhm.
moving our bodies around in a
Mhm.
certain way, having such an incredible healing
Mhm.
effect on all of us in the circle."
Mhm.
So just this idea of like doing things like that that are more
Mm.
physical and embodied.
Mhm.
Well, like,
Yeah.
how does it work?
How does that what has happens? I mean, I love a good, like, intellectualization. I love,
Mhm.
like, talking about my feelings but not feeling them, or, like, my therapist calls it
Right.
hovering. Um, and, yeah, I think one of the things that came to mind as I was listening to your question was, this incredible mentor, Sage Hayes, that I have offered, a workshop last year, and it was emergent it was just
Mm.
emergent, right? We were, like, getting together, we were all practitioners, and I at that time was really curious about touch-based practices, and feeling really excited that I'm not a licensed therapist,
Mhm.
which means that I can touch people, and, like, my scope of practice can look different, and, um, I was working on someone, and Sage Sage was like, "Pull back."
Mm.
And because I remember, like, being focused on this part of the body and, like, my attention really going there, and then, like, the pull back, and so I pull back, and I see this breath come from this body of, like,
Mm.
and I was like, "Oh," and then Sage was like, "Keep going." And I was like, "Oh," and I saw another big breath from this
Mm.
body that I had hands on, and then all of a sudden, I feel in my like, at the top of my crown, just this, like, and I was like, "Oh, there it is," right? Like, there was just this, like, without sounding, like, too out there, but I felt like the galaxy,
Mm.
right? There was just, like, some greater intelligence that was coming through because I got out of the way,
Mhm.
versus when I'm like this,
Mm.
and I'm like this a
Mhm.
lot in
Mhm.
different ways, but I think just, like, the humor for one, and, like, the experience of what happens when I come back, right? And I kinda made a joke when we were sitting of, like, I like a good lean back,
Mhm.
because and we can even notice in conversation when somebody starts talking about something you're interested
Mhm.
in, right? Which is totally normal and cool, and, like, yes, and there's also something really cool that happens when you
Mhm.
come back. Um, and I like the embodiment is there's, I think for me, like, and the curiosity around, like, my current constitution is around space and time, and what happens when, yes, one-on-one work, like, I go to therapy, it's really important, that relationship, and I also have opportunities to practice with community that is dedicated to these principles, and, in particular around conflict and rupture, and what can
Mhm.
happen when we have, sustained practice and accountability. And, and then there's also this, like, if we were to take a glass of water and we drop food coloring, right? Versus, like, going into a pool and dropping food coloring, like, this opportunity for things to diffuse and disperse because we have more hands holding.
Mhm.
And it's not more hand holding and caretaking. It's an expression of care in leaning back and creating a wider field for that other person to really feel like they have space to be seen, right? To feel. Um, and we're just here. And like that's a beautiful thing when it's available.
Mhm.
I love how the kids, at least this seems to be in Aiden's circle, they are all taught very early to say, I need space.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's not something I ever said before.
I did, but I was yelling, and I was a teenager, and then I would say, "I hate you,"
And there was doors
and then I would slam my door. Yeah, yeah, yeah. My son recently has been going to sleep at night. Like we'll do a little chat and we'll read a book, and um, there'll be a point where he'll he'll be like, "I'm all done talking," and roll over, and I'm like, "Excuse me."
Oh my gosh,
Your
I wish.
But like that doesn't mean like his other thing is like why, because he's very like circular conversations, but just like I'm all done talking, and like kids are great at being like I'm done being here.
Yeah.
I want to go home.
Yeah.
I don't
like it
I don't
here.
like it. I don't
Yeah.
like this. And that's real.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's hope for the future still.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm done talking. No, no, I'm
And see.
kidding.
Well, it does kind of feel like we're done talking.
I think we're rounding
right?
out. Yeah. Feels that
And
way.
so you're working in the schools now. Do you have
Mhm.
any workshops coming up or?
Not currently. I
Mhm.
think the summer is going to be a little bit of a reprieve.
Mhm.
Yeah, and also continuing with client work.
Mhm.
Um,
And your
mhm,
client work is one-on-one.
mhm.
And do you also work with couples or relation?
I have an incredible mentor um, who developed this curriculum called Loving Conflict.
Mhm.
And it's essentially a way to be in conflict and remain connected. Um, an incredible person, incredible practice. So I have done work facilitating that with couples and different relationships that come in. So
Mhm.
yeah.
That feels very timely and
Yeah.
important.
And I've done that
That's
also
good.
in schools as well.
Mhm.
Yeah. Hmm.
And people can work with you and find you on your
They
website?
can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add
Mm.
before we?
Mm. Thanks for asking. I don't know where this lands, but for whatever reason, it's coming in, so I'm going to name it.
Mhm.
But I think as we're kind of ending and just kind of like touching into this idea of conflict and repair, um, there's another kind of infographic or model that I love to offer in just experimenting with the idea of accountability and what that looks like for kids, and just showing like the range of there's accountability and there's shame and there's blame, and
Mhm.
just the curiosity of where we might tend to go in, and that changes with every relationship and every power dynamic, and um how we can find like what accountability feels like, what it looks like. How can we be in integrity in the ways in which we kind of move through spaces and code switch, and um yeah, so maybe someone needed
Well,
to
I
hear
needed to hear that.
Yeah.
The other day, we were playing with our friends. Aiden poured water on his friend, and I had to intervene when he tried to do it again. It was very ugly. And all he kept saying was, so and so is stupid. So and so is stupid. And
Yeah.
I was like, they didn't do anything.
Mhm.
You poured the water. They didn't
Mhm.
want that. I was
Mhm.
stopping you. But in my brain, I left there and it's like, add it to the list to research. Like,
Mhm.
why is
Mhm.
he projecting his behavior?
Mhm.
Because they weren't even by each other. He just
Mhm.
decided to walk over and pour it on them, totally
Mhm.
instigated the whole thing,
Yeah.
but would not accept that he had did
Oh,
it.
it's so hard. I know.
Which, I mean,
Yeah.
he's 3.5,
Yeah.
but but that's on my list.
Yeah.
You reminded me.
Yeah. No, and it's also like if I were in just like how is this a reflection on me? Like how wow. But the thing that I noticed at least is like offering because we get into this like rushed apology, right?
Right.
Where just like if just go say I'm sorry, right? And if there's an apology, there's also hopefully a behavior change, right?
Right.
And if we rush the apology, then we don't really go through those steps
Yeah.
of accountability. And sometimes I'll just offer like, you know, a brief explanation. Are you ready to say I'm sorry? And if he'll say no, I'll be like, okay, so I'm gonna help you. Right. And I'll at least like say like, you know, so and so sorry, whatever. But I think that there's such a it's such like a it's such a cruel like there can be like a meanness that happens because of we're playing roles, right? It is like theater.
Right.
And
Right.
as long as, you know, there's touching back into that moment at a time where maybe it feels available or maybe not. There's been so many times where I've like tried to go back to River into a scene and he's like not interested, you know, but it'll come back around. Um yeah, there's like an audacity and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that um in that particular scene of wanting ownership, just the curiosity of like, well, what if it's not available in this moment? Like how to support that for when it could be.
So I'm going to add this on because I'm making a connection here because I not only do I see this in my child, I see it with some adults and how when they feel like they did something wrong, they go into freeze or fight mode,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Because it doesn't feel safe to have done something wrong. And it
Double
makes
down.
yeah.
Double down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about a recent conversation that we had, a few of our recent conversations where we're talking about men and not to be in the binary or gender stereotyping,
Sure.
but there have been things going on with men's groups and men's spaces
Oh my gosh.
that are, you know, from less than ideal behavior to outrageous behavior, completely unacceptable, right?
Yes.
And so how do we show up?
Yeah.
You know, everyone will show up differently, but I try to show up without like an attacking energy in the hopes that it will help them step into that place of accountability.
It's such a fun dance. It's such a fun and like, yes, the shame, blame, the accountability, like dependent upon the relationship, I will be on either end. And it also has to do with who has more power, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there is that dance in partnership that I think that's what you're talking about.
Well,
or just in general,
in
like
general,
larger.
like,
Yeah.
you know, because have been women saying, you know, like, you know,
Done with men.
yeah, done with men, you know, men's groups, this, that, whatever. We interviewed Duncan
Oh
Rich
yeah. Duncan does
recently,
beautiful
who
work.
does men's work, right?
Yeah.
So we were, you know, being curious with his perspective on things. But yeah, definitely for me personally, with the men in my life, but also how I show up like publicly, right? On social media or on this show, right? What is the energy that I'm carrying to show to folks my expectations or my role in witnessing their behavior.
Are you talking about boundaries?
Well, yeah, that's a whole other subject, but it's, you know, like you said, there's probably a time and a place for all different responses to a specific behavior. My concern is that if we are shut down, we'll just stick with the theme, men's behavior, in some of these spaces, and that it will further alienate them and shut them down rather than help them take accountability for their actions.
It's interesting. I mean, I will say one of the curiosities that I've had is how like that patriarchal archetype shows up in my own
Mhm.
system, because I definitely have that as somebody who has a lot of fight in their system.
Mhm.
Um, and in the ways in which, like, it by relational dynamic that might show up, and the polarity that might come from that. So I yeah, I wonder too about um how how to have how to, like, call someone into conversation,
Right,
right?
right,
This,
right.
like, this deeper truth that might be possible. And I also think that we're at a time where there's such like, there are things that are happening that there's, like, the nuance, sure, it's always both
Yeah,
end, but
yeah,
there are atrocities that are happening
yeah.
that, like, a charged response is the appropriate
Mhm. Yeah,
response. And if we're talking about the ways that can show up on a relational, and like on a micro level or a macro level, um there's I think there's an opportunity to get in, like, deeper clarity with um with who we are, what we stand for, and how that integrity can support another person coming into deeper truth.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
Versus, like, the kind of pursuit and, like, the yelling, which I've
Mhm.
Right.
also done a fair
Mhm.
amount,
Right, right,
or demanding that
Mhm.
something be different.
right,
Mhm.
And sometimes it's just, like, giving it space
right.
to be what it is, to accept it, and then to come back with an invitation,
Yeah.
which can sometimes get lost in a lot of
The
times get lost
yelling.
in the cancel culture, right? It's the
Mhm.
same as, like, if we have the capitalist movement and we have capitalism and anti-capitalism, but bio talks about this too. It's still feeding the capitalist
Mhm.
Yeah,
movement. So we can
yeah,
have these, like, anti-movements that are really just the same thing
Mhm.
and
yeah.
perpetuating the same harm.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and it makes me think, you know, I'm directly making this connection between how would I respond to Aiden acting
Mhm.
out,
Oh, yeah.
and, like, thinking, if he doesn't feel safe, if I'm making him feel bad,
Yeah.
right? That's one form of parenting, but I'm
Mhm.
trying not to do that, even
Mhm.
though I'm not perfect and I
Mhm.
definitely get mad, and
Mhm.
he probably feels bad
Mhm.
sometimes. But thinking about, if that's my model for
Mhm.
him, then
Mhm.
why don't I apply that model to an adult man?
Mhm.
Oof.
And
Yeah.
I had a really interesting experience recently where somebody, a man, an adult man, said that by observing how he relates to my son,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
what he was
Mhm.
like when he was little,
Mhm.
and he said,
Mhm.
watching you respond to
Mhm.
him is healing
Mm.
my trauma from my childhood.
Mm.
Mhm.
And so, sorry.
Mhm. Please don't be.
It just makes me think, like, maybe we need more love and acceptance
Yeah.
Mhm.
instead of boundaries, even though, like, everything we're taught and even
Yeah.
what we feel intuitively is like, no, this is
Mhm.
wrong and
Yeah.
you
Mhm.
have to stop
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not the answer.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And we can do that in a loving way,
Yeah.
right? Clear is kind.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Right?
Mhm.
Like, I think especially with children, they need to know where they end and another person. It's always about finding the edges.
Yeah.
It's always like, who am I? Where am I? Right? And the more we can be that, right? Because there's going to be other versions of, like, pushing and testing, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
um but I think even to have that reflection of,
Mhm.
right, when we're kind of, like, reflected in our community of, like, you're doing this thing that's radical and it's beautiful to witness, and we know how hard it is.
Mhm.
And finding other people who are like, yes, that, because we know that that's the thing that that's the world we want to
Mhm.
create together.
Yeah, and how we shift it. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot how when someone says even a small thing, even as an adult, "Oh, you did this thing, it hurt my feelings. You did
Mhm.
this thing, it was wrong." Like for
Mhm.
me at least, like so much shame comes
Totally.
up, right? And there's this tendency to be defensive and
Mhm.
be like, "Well, I didn't, da da
Mhm.
da da da." And I feel like that's probably because of the way we're treated when we're younger, right? And
Yeah.
like, no, don't
Mhm.
do that, and that's bad, right?
Yeah.
Because I just wonder, like, why do I feel
Mhm.
so much
Mhm.
shame about doing something wrong
Yeah.
and making a mistake, right? Like,
Yeah.
it feels disproportionate to someone kindly telling me, like, oh, you did this thing. It didn't feel so good. What do you mean it didn't feel
Yeah.
good, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I feel like, that's like a big thing that needs to be healed.
I think, and also the expectation, like, we're gonna fuck it up,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think this is where relationships over time are the thing in the way we get to practice, right? Like, you feel that, like, wave of heat that makes
Yeah.
you nauseous when someone says you did this thing, and, like, maybe that might not be the time to have the conversation because that part really needs some
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
Being like, "Oh, it's okay," right? Like, um, but then the fact that we can go into that conversation with the person that we're gonna see again and
Yeah.
again
Yeah.
and again and be in, like, real life
Yeah.
with them. That part of us that, like,
Yeah.
right, gets to learn that it's okay to make a mistake because there's evidence now that that person's not gonna
Yeah.
disappear or you're not gonna your belonging isn't threatened in your community, right, because you made a mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you're not being punished for it.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
you're not loved.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're still likable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even
Because
with your
essentially
flaws.
yeah, we kind of like that harm either gets internalized or externalized, and then we're just in this
Yeah.
in like the cycle of harm,
Mhm.
right? Or we could be this is like another model that Shar uses often, like the cycle of harm. I think it's from the NARM training or like cycles of resilience and looking at the two different like accountability is also a huge piece, but it's also like this it's care. It's care based practice. And it doesn't it's not care in the way that it's placating or pacifying.
Right.
It's active. Love is active. Care is active. Right? It is like it is in the front body, the back body, in like it's through our whole body.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there has to be like the sacrifice of integrity to show care. At least, yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
love that.
Okay. I'm going to stop talking because
okay.
resilience is a whole other subject.
No, we
Yeah.
could just keep going
Yeah.
on and on.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
been so lovely,
Mm.
Christie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really good to be with you both.
Yeah, it was really nice
Yeah.
to have you
Mhm.
and to be like together in person
Yeah.
felt really
And
good
sit this
too.
close.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.